Good morning. So far, we have learned the dimension of the difference of diversity. The social class. The U.S. Constitution declares that all people are created equal, but class difference to exist, right? And they affect communication patterns. Social psychologist Michael Eckley reports that the cues we use to identify class distinctions are way of life. First, way of life. Two, second, family. Third, job. Fourth, money. And education. Right? Some principles that describe how social classes emerge from society include virtually every organization or group develops hierarchy that makes status distinctions. We are more likely to interact with people from our own social class, right? There seems to be some truth to the maxim. You know, the birds of the feather flock together. People who interact with one another over time tend to communicate in similar ways. They develop the similar speech patterns and use similar expressions. Mhm. Members of a social class develop the ways of communicating class difference to others by the way they dress, the cars they drive, the home they live in, and the schools they attend, as well as these other visible symbols of a social class. It is possible to change one's social class, through the education, employment, and income. Right. Okay. Difference in social class and attendant differences in education and lifestyle affects who we talk with and even what we talk about. This difference influence of our overall cultural standpoint from which we perceive the world. We learn to we keep the understanding culture. We learn keep understanding culture, the dimensions of our mental software. Our mental software. Do you know the culture, right? Culture is a learned system of knowledge, behavior, attitude, beliefs, and values and norms that is shaped by a group of people. We learn that, right? In the broadest sense, culture includes how people think, what they do, and how they use things to sustain their lives. Researchers Greg Hofstede described culture as the mental software or mental programming of a human mind that touches every aspect of how we make sense of the world and ensure that sense with others. Just like software installed on a computer, our culture influences how we process information. Just like a software installed on a computer, our culture influences how we process information. To interact with other people is to be touched by the influence of culture and cultural difference. Your culture and your life experiences determine your worldview. Worldview means individual perceptions or perceptions by a culture or group of people about key beliefs and issues such as death, God, and the meaning of life, which influences interaction with others. You cannot avoid having a worldview. Your personal worldview is so pervasive that you may not even be aware of it. Just as a goldfish may not be aware of water in its bowl, you may not be aware of how your worldview influences every aspect of your life, how you see and what you think. Okay? When we speak of culture, we may sometimes be referring to a co-culture. Co-culture. A co-culture is a microculture. That means a distinct culture within a larger culture, such as the gay and lesbian co-culture. A co-culture is a distinct culture within a large culture. The difference of gender, sexual orientation, ethnic, age, and social class that we discussed earlier are co-cultures within the predominant culture. For example, about 72% of the population of the United States is classified as white, European, American, or Caucasian. Members of minority groups such as African Americans, Latinos, and Asian developed a co-culture, or what is sometimes called a microculture. The Amish, Mennonite, Mormon, Islamic, and Jewish religious group, additional example of important religious co-cultures. Often, because they are in the minority, members of co-culture not only feel marginalized, they are marginalized in employment, education, housing, and other aspects of society. To enhance their power and self-identity, members of core cultures may develop their own rules and norms, right? Teens, yeah, teens develop their own slang or certain kinds of clothing, value certain kinds of music, and engage in other behaviors that make it easier for them to be identified apart from the larger culture. The cultural elements are not rooted in a biology, but learned, passed on from parents to children, right? In culturation, the process of transmitting transmitting a group's culture from one generation to the next. Enculturation is the process of transmitting a group's culture from one generation to the next from those within that culture, such as parents, brothers and sisters, or grandparents. This happens naturally through the association and storytelling, as well as by example. Acculturation, a related concept. Acculturation is the process of how people from the new host culture transmit values, ideas, and beliefs to people outside the host culture. So, when your parents teach you how to eat with a chopstick, or that's enculturation. But when a teacher or friend shows you proper manners and etiquette, that's acculturation, right? Whether from within the culture or from the host culture, both processes describe how you learn about culture. You are not born from a host culture. Both processes describe both. Uh, you are not born with a certain taste in music, food, or automobile. You learn the behavior in accordance with the element that characterizes your culture. Research. Researchers have identified 7 dimensions that they say appear in all of the cultures they have studied. Think of these dimensions as general ways of describing how culture is expressed in the behavior of groups of people. The 7 dimensions are individualism versus collectivism. Individualism versus collectivism. Individualism means an emphasis on the individual. The collectivism means an emphasis on the group. Second, an emphasis on Second dimension, emphasis on the surrounding context, including nonverbal behaviors, versus little emphasis on context. Surrounding context, a little emphasis on context. Third dimension, the masculine values that emphasize accomplishment versus family. Masculine versus feminine is a feminine value that emphasizes nurturing. As the fourth dimension is a degree of the tolerance for uncertainty. Fifth dimension is approach to power. Sixth dimension is short or long-term approaches to time. And last one, indulgence versus restraint. Individualism. One of the most prominent dimensions of a culture is that of individualism versus collectivism. In the individualistic cultures, such as those in North America, value individual achievement and personal accomplishment. Collectivistic cultures, including many Asian cultures, value group and team achievement. Individualistic cultures tend to be more loosely knit socially. Individuals feel responsible for taking care of themselves and their immediate families. In collectivistic cultures, individuals expect more support from others. They also experience more place, more value on we than I. Teamwork, teamwork approach usually successful in their workplace. Context. The context, low, high, and low, is different, right? Individuals from different cultures use cues from the cultural context to varying degrees to enhance message and meaning. This insight led anthropologist Edward T. Hall to categorize the cultures as a high or either high or low context. In high context cultures means a culture in which people derive much information from nonverbal and environmental cues. Otherwise, low context culture means culture in which people drop story, but information from the words of a message and last information from nonverbal and environmental cue. In high context cultures, nonverbal cues are extremely important in the interpreting message. Low, low context cultures rely more explicitly on language and use fewer contextual cues to send and interpret information. Individuals from high context culture may perceive people from low context culture as less attractive, knowledgeable, and trustworthy because they violate unspoken laws of dress, conduct, and communication. So individuals from the low context cultures often are not skilled in interpreting unspoken contextual messages. For example, the Darwin is an exchange student who grew up in Tokyo, Japan, a high context culture. If you grew up in Dallas, Texas, low context culture, you may want to tone down your gestures, facial expression, and other overly expressed nonverbal cues when talking with Darwin. And Darwin may want to be more expressive when interacting with you. The challenge is to be aware of culture difference and preference without going to extreme adapting to another person. As in all other oriented conversation, before premeditating how you will adopt your conversation style, you may want to observe and listen. You want to be appropriately sensitive without overacting based on the stereotypes or expectation. The gender, masculine and feminine. You know the masculine cultures is when which people tended to value traditional roles from man and woman, achievement, assertiveness, heroism, and material wealth. But feminine cultures, so culture in which people tended to value caring, sensitivity, and attention to quality of life. It is different, right? Some cultures emphasize traditional male values. Others place greater value of a female perspective. These values are not really about biological sex differences, but about overarching approaches to interacting with others. Rely, rarely are cultures on the extreme end of a continuum. Many are somewhere in between. For centuries, most countries in Europe, Asia, and America have had masculine cultures. Men and their conquest dominant, dominate history books. Men have been more prominent in leadership, and this isn't making them women. But today, many of these cultures are moving slowly toward the middle. Legal and social laws encourage more gender balance and greater equality between masculine and feminine roles. Uncertainty, we think about the tolerance. There's a high tolerance and low tolerance. Some culture tolerate more ambiguity and uncertainty than others. Cultures in which people need certainty to feel secure are more likely to create and enforce rigid rules for behavior and to develop more elaborate codes of conduct. And the power, yeah. Oh yeah. Talk about tolerance. I need to talk more. The research suggests that people from Portugal, Greece, Peru, Belgium, and Japan have a high certainty needs, while people from Scandinavian countries tend to tolerate uncertainty. Power. Approaches to power is centralized and decentralized. Some cultures value unequal or decentralized distribution of power, whereas others accept a concentration of hierarchical power in centralized government and other organizations. Russia, France, and China are all high on the concentrated power scale. Those are often strive for greater equality and distribution of power and control include many citizens of Australia, Denmark, New Zealand, and Israel. People from these Other countries tended to minimize difference in power between people. Another thing is time, short term and long term. A culture's orientation to time falls on continuum between long term and short term. People from a culture with a long term orientation to time place an emphasis on the future and tend to value perseverance and drift because they are virtues that pay off over a long period of time. A long-term time orientation also implied a greater willingness to subordinate oneself for a larger purpose, such as the good of society or the group. In contrast, a culture that tends to have a short-term time orientation values spending rather than saving because it focuses on the immediate rather than the future. Tradition because of the value placed on the present and the past, and the preserving phase of both self and others, making sure that an individual is respected and that his or her dignity in upheld. Short-term cultures also expect that results will soon follow the actions and effort expended on task. These kinds of cultures place a high value on social and status obligations. So, um, such as China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, mm, Korea, and Japan. In Asian cultures, many Asian cultures has a long-term time orientation. Short-term time orientation cultures include Pakistan, the um, Nigeria, Spain, and the Philippines. Both Canada and United States are closer to short-term rather than long-term time orientation. Okay. Last things, happiness. Um, okay, happiness, indulgent and restrained. You know, the newest culture dimension added by intercultural researcher Gear Hofstede is the idea that some cultures indulge and focus on behaviors that make them happy more than other cultures group. These more indulgent cultures desire and expect freedom and happiness. They also tended to value freedom of speech and place high value on the leisure activities and sport. They also tend to value freedom of speech, yeah, and place a high value on leisure activities and sport. So cultures that are more restrained do not necessarily expect to have all of their needs met to achieve happiness. They are less likely to remember positive emotions and have a fewer expectation about participating in leisure activities, including sports. So, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and Australia examples of more indulgent cultures. In contrast, Russia, China, and much of Eastern Europe are more restrained cultures. Barriers of effective intercultural communication. Understanding culture. Many of the dimensions of our mental software we learned that, yeah? Individualism, context, gender, uncertainty, power, time, and happiness, right? So, individualism, the countries of that's higher on this culture's dimension. United States, Australia, Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, France. In countries, the score the lower on the individual, the culture dimension, the country there are countries that are Guatemala, Europe, Ecuador, Panama, Venezuela, Indonesia, Pakistan, Costa Rica, Peru, Thailand, South Korea, Colombia. Is it? Look at that. The context. High context society prepared to draw information from the surrounding context, including non-verbal messages. Lower context societies tended to prepare information to be presented explicitly, usually in word. The countries that score higher include Japan, China, Saudi Arabia, Italy, Greece, South Korea, but other the score lower countries Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, United States, Australia. like gender cultural dimension, and societies with greater emphasis on the masculine value achievement, assertiveness, heroism, material wealth, and more clearly differentiated sex role. People from less masculine as a feminine cultures tended to value caring, sensitivity, and attention to quality of life. So, Japan, such as Japan, Australia, Venezuela, Italy, Switzerland, Mexico, Ireland, Jamaica, and Great Britain is higher. Um, um, the higher the score is higher on the masculinity culture or dimension, and other and in contrast the other countries like Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, Costa Rica, Finland, Chile, Portugal, Thailand, um, the score lower on the gender. Okay. Um, do you know the intercultural communication, right? Communications between or among people who have different cultural tradition. That's intercultural communication. Do you know the culture shock? Yeah? Culture shock means the feelings of stress and anxiety a person experiences when encountering a culture difference from he or her own. So we will examine some of these barriers first and then discuss strategies and skill for overcoming them. Okay? All good people agree, and all good people say, a nice people like us are we, and every one us is they. You know that. Okay. Mm, okay. In a few short lines, Rud- uh, Rudyard Kipling captures the essence of what sociologists and anthropologists call ethnocentric thinking. Members of all societies tended to believe that all nice people like us are we. find comfort in the familiar and often denigrate or distrust others. Of course, with the training or experience in other clients, they may learn to transcend their provincialism, placing themselves in others' shoes. Okay. As Kipling put it, if you cross of the sea instead of other the way, you may end by, think about it, looking only as one shore of day. A main lesson of intercultural communication is to begin to cross of the sea, to learn to understand why other people think and act as they do, and to be able to empathize with their perspectives. Ethnocentrism means belief that your cultural traditions and assumptions are superior to those of others. Okay. Okay. What are specific strategy to avoid being ethnocentric? Be mindful. Be mindful. You cannot change what you want aware of. Honestly, consider whether you harbor unhealthy ethnocentric views toward a culture, co-culture, or ethnic group. Okay? Avoid stereotypes. View people as individuals rather than a stereotype or caricatures fused by media or literature characterizations. People are not certain characters. People are not certain characters. They are multidimensional. They are multidimensional. Separate the politics from the person. The politics promoted by a given leader of a country are not necessarily representative of a people who live in the country. Whether you encounter a person from a country with unfriendly political views who live in your community, or you visit a country with questionable politics, separate the people you meet from the political view of the leaders of the country. So, separate the politics from the person. Last thing is communicate interpersonal rather than impersonally. communicate interpersonally rather than impersonally. When you interact with people often, seek to move beyond judgmental, impersonal communication to a more meaningful, authentic interpersonal relationship. Different communication code. Different communication code. Today, even when you travel within the United States, you are likely to encounter people who do not speak your language. Obviously, this kind of intercultural difference poses formidable communication challenges. And even when you do speak the same language as someone else, he or she may come from a place where certain words and gestures have different meanings. You know. As William Goody Const wisely note, if you understand each other's language but not their culture, we can make fluent fools of others. Even when language is translated, meaning can be missed or mangled. It's a Colgate Palmolive, Palmolive advertised is a new toothpaste named Cueq in France before the company realized that Q also happened to be the name of a widely circulated pornographic book about oral sex. Like the different communication code. Pepsi Cola is a "Come Alive with Pepsi" campaign. When translated for the Taiwanese market, conveyed the unsettling news that Pepsi bring your ancestors back from the grave. Like that. Stereotyping and prejudice. You know the stereotypes that took place a person or a group of a person into an inflexible, all-encompassing category. All Europeans dress fashionably, all Asians are good at math, all Americans like to drive big cars. That's a stereotype. Prejudice. Prejudice is a judgment or opinion of someone formed before you know all of the facts or the background of that person. Okay. Assuming similarities, assuming differences, you know. Um, okay. Today we learned the interpersonal communication and diversity, adapting to others. Okay. So we have to improve in intercultural communication competence. Okay. So next we talked about that. Continue that. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.